What happens when an intelligence estimate is off by a factor of 7? On the morning of March 24, 1945, German reconnaissance units along the Rhine River sent urgent reports to their commanders. The message was clear. Approximately 3 Allied divisions were preparing to cross the Great Water Barrier that had protected the Reich for centuries. Standard defensive protocols were initiated. Artillery batteries were positioned. Reserve units were placed on alert. It was manageable. It was containable. Then the sky turned black. Not with storm clouds, but with aircraft. Thousands upon thousands of aircraft, stretching from horizon to horizon, their engines creating a sound like continuous thunder that shook the earth itself. German soldiers looked up in disbelief as the largest airborne armada in history blotted out the sun. Within hours, the terrible truth became undeniable. It wasn't 3 divisions crossing the Rhine. It was 21 divisions, supported by the most massive airborne operation ever conceived, executing a military maneuver so overwhelming in scale that it would make the Normandy invasion look modest by comparison. This is the story of Operation Plunder and Operation Varsity, the Rhine crossing that shattered the last natural defense of Nazi Germany. But more than that, it's the story of how American and British forces learned from every mistake, every setback, every bloody lesson of the previous 4 years of war, and applied that knowledge to create a military operation of such devastating efficiency that it would change warfare forever. This is about the moment when the theoretical became reality, when overwhelming force met meticulous planning, and when the German military finally understood that the war was truly, irreversibly lost. The Rhine crossing wasn't just a battle, it was a statement. It was the Allies declaring that no river, no fortress, no desperate defense could stop what was coming. And on that March morning in 1945, when German scouts realized their catastrophic miscalculation, they understood something profound. They weren't just facing an army, they were facing the future of warfare itself. The Rhine River had been Germany's natural fortress for 2,000 years. Julius Caesar himself had struggled to cross it during his Gallic campaigns. Napoleon had understood its strategic significance. Every German schoolchild learned that the Rhine was more than a river. It was the blood vessel of the nation, the liquid wall that separated civilization from chaos, the final barrier between the Reich and total defeat. By March 1945, that barrier was all Germany had left. The context requires us to step back 6 months, to September 1944, when the Allied advance across France had moved so quickly that commanders began to believe the war might end before Christmas. Operation Market Garden, that audacious attempt to seize bridges across Holland and leap the Rhine in one dramatic thrust, had promised to deliver exactly that outcome. Field Marshal Montgomery had been convinced. Eisenhower had given his cautious approval. American paratroopers and British armored divisions had launched what they believed would be the war's final act. Instead, they found hell at Arnhem. The story of Market Garden is essential to understanding what happened at the Rhine crossing 6 months later, because every mistake made in September became a lesson applied in March. At Arnhem, airborne forces had been dropped too far from their objectives. They had landed in daylight, sacrificing surprise for accuracy. They had been given inadequate intelligence about German defenses, particularly about the presence of SS Panzer divisions refitting in the area. Most critically, the ground forces meant to relieve them had been delayed by fierce resistance along a single exposed road. The result was catastrophic. Of the 10,000 British paratroopers who landed at Arnhem, fewer than 3,000 escaped. The remainder were killed or captured. The bridge, immortalized as a bridge too far, remained in German hands. The Rhine remained uncrossed, and the war, which might have ended in 1944, ground onward into a winter of continued slaughter. But military organizations learn, or they die. The American and British high commands absorbed the lessons of Arnhem with the intensity of students preparing for a final examination upon which their lives depended, because quite literally, they did. General Bernard Montgomery, whose reputation had been severely damaged by Market Garden's failure, became obsessed with ensuring that the Rhine crossing would be executed with such overwhelming superiority that failure would be impossible. General Dwight Eisenhower, who had supported Market Garden and shared in its failure, determined that the next major river crossing would be approached not with audacity, but with suffocating, methodical superiority. No risks, no gambles, no reliance on luck or surprise. The Rhine would be crossed by applying such massive force that German resistance would simply be obliterated. By March 1945, the strategic situation had evolved dramatically. The Soviets were driving toward Berlin from the east. American forces under Patton had already achieved a surprise crossing at Remagen when German defenders failed to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge in time. But Remagen was a fortunate accident, a bridge that shouldn't have been standing, a crossing executed on the fly without the massive logistics that a major operation required. Montgomery's crossing, codenamed Operation Plunder, would be different. It would be the deliberate, crushing hammer blow that would shatter Germany's last organized defense. And it would be supported by Operation Varsity, an airborne assault that would apply every lesson learned from Arnhem, from Normandy, from Sicily, from every airborne operation of the war. The date was set, March 23rd, 24th, 1945. The location, the northern Rhine, near the German cities of Wesel, Ries and Emmerich. The forces, the British Second Army and the US Ninth Army, together comprising over 1 million men. The supporting airborne operation, the US 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division, delivered by over 1,500 transport aircraft and 1,300 gliders. The German defenders knew the Allies were coming. They knew the Rhine would be attacked. They established observation posts, reinforced defensive positions, and positioned artillery to target the obvious crossing points. Their intelligence services worked frantically to determine where and when the assault would come and in what strength. And that's where the story becomes truly remarkable, because German intelligence did detect the Allied buildup. They did identify crossing preparations, they did estimate enemy strength, and they concluded that approximately 3 divisions, perhaps 4 at most, were preparing to execute a limited crossing operation in the northern sector. They were looking at 1/7 of the actual force. They were preparing for a battle when they should have been preparing for an apocalypse. They believed they were facing a river crossing when they were actually facing the largest coordinated assault operation of the European war. The stage was set. Over 1 million Allied soldiers waited along the western bank of the Rhine, concealed in forests, hidden in villages, packed into assembly areas with a density that had required months of logistical preparation. Across the river, German defenders manned their positions, confident that the Rhine would do what it had always done, protect the fatherland. At dawn on March 23, 1945, that protection was about to be tested as it had never been tested before, and the German scouts who had estimated 3 divisions were about to learn the most terrifying lesson of their military careers. In modern warfare, overwhelming force isn't just an advantage. It's a form of psychological warfare that destroys the enemy's will before the first shot is even fired. The genesis of Operation Plunder began not in the spring of 1945, but in the bitter aftermath of Market Garden in September 1944. In the command tents and headquarters buildings scattered across liberated France and Belgium, Allied commanders gathered to conduct what military organizations call lessons learned sessions. Though in this case, the lessons had been written in the blood of thousands of paratroopers. General Bernard Montgomery, whose reputation for meticulous planning had been tarnished by Market Garden's failure, became almost obsessively focused on redemption. Those who worked closely with him during this period noted a change in his demeanor. The confident, almost arrogant British Field Marshal who had defeated Rommel at El Alamein now spent hours poring over operational details that he previously would have delegated to staff officers. He demanded multiple redundancies for every critical element. He insisted on overwhelming superiority at every point of contact. Montgomery's Chief of Staff, General Francis de Guingand, later wrote that the Field Marshal seemed haunted by Arnhem. In private conversations, Montgomery reportedly said, "We asked too much of too few. We relied on speed when we should have relied on strength. We hoped the Germans would be surprised and disorganized. We gambled. At the Rhine, we will not gamble." This philosophy, the rejection of gambling in favor of overwhelming, methodical application of force, became the foundation upon which Operation Plunder was built. But philosophy alone doesn't win battles. The operational planning that emerged from this philosophy represented something remarkable in military history, an almost scientific approach to warfare that treated every variable as measurable, every risk as calculable, every contingency as preventable. The planning process began in November 1944, when it became clear that the war would not end before Christmas. Allied intelligence had determined that any crossing of the Rhine in strength would require months of preparation. The Rhine wasn't just wide, In many places, it exceeded 300 meters across. It was also fast-flowing, with currents that could sweep away assault boats. Its banks were often steep, making vehicle exit from landing craft difficult. And the Germans, fully aware of its strategic importance, had fortified the eastern bank with impressive defensive works. Lieutenant General William Simpson, commanding the U.S. Ninth Army, partnered with Montgomery to develop a crossing plan that would leverage American material superiority and British tactical experience. Simpson, a quiet Texan who avoided publicity but earned the deep respect of his troops, brought a methodical approach that complemented Montgomery's planning obsession perfectly. The two commanders established several fundamental principles. First, the crossing would be preceded by the most intensive artillery bombardment of the European war, designed not merely to damage German defenses, but to psychologically stun the defenders into temporary inability to respond effectively. Second, the assault would occur at multiple points simultaneously, preventing Germans from concentrating their mobile reserves against any single crossing point. Third, airborne forces would be employed not ahead of the ground assault, as at Arnhem, but in direct coordination with it, landing after the artillery preparation, within hours of the initial river crossing, and close enough to the ground forces that link-up would be measured in hours rather than days. Fourth, and perhaps most critically, nothing would be rushed. Speed had killed the Arnhem operation when ground forces couldn't advance quickly enough along that single exposed road. At the Rhine, timetables would be realistic. Units would be given time to consolidate after crossing. Bridges would be constructed with engineering resources so massive that German artillery couldn't destroy them faster than they could be repaired or replaced. The logistical planning required for this approach was staggering. The Allies would need thousands of assault boats, hundreds of landing craft, specialized amphibious vehicles, bridging equipment measured in miles rather than feet, and ammunition stockpiles so vast that they dwarfed anything previously assembled in Europe. Every division participating in the assault would require its own dedicated supply system, with multiple redundancies built in to prevent the kind of supply failures that had plagued earlier operations. The formation of the assault force reflected this meticulous approach. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would execute the northern crossing with the British 2nd Army under General Miles Dempsey and the US 9th Army under Simpson. The British 13th Corps, XXX Corps and the 8th Corps would attack along a broad front near Wesel and Ries. The American 15th Corps would cross slightly to the south. Each corps was reinforced far beyond standard tables of organization. Artillery was concentrated at densities that exceeded even the massive bombardments of World War I. The British alone assembled over 3,000 artillery pieces for the operation, roughly one gun for every 12 meters of front. American artillery units added another 2,000 tubes. The result was an artillery force capable of delivering crushing fire on any target within range, with enough ammunition stockpiled to sustain maximum rate fire for days if necessary. But artillery alone wouldn't win the battle. The assault would require engineers to perform miracles under fire. British and American engineer battalions trained for months on river crossing techniques. They practiced with the exact types of boats and rafts they would use. They rehearsed bridge construction until they could do it in darkness, under simulated enemy fire, with key personnel intentionally removed from the chain to test redundancy systems. Combat engineers studied the Rhine itself with the intensity of doctoral candidates. They measured current speeds at different points and different times of day. They analyzed the composition of the riverbanks to determine optimal landing sites. They calculated precisely how long it would take various types of craft to cross under different conditions. They even accounted for the psychological effect of crossing a major water barrier under fire, building in extra time allowances for the inevitable confusion and fear that would slow operations. The airborne component, Operation Varsity, underwent equally intensive preparation. The US 17th Airborne Division and British 6th Airborne Division would drop east of the Rhine in a zone carefully selected to block German reinforcements while being close enough to ground forces for rapid link-up. The airborne commanders had studied Arnhem obsessively. They knew exactly what had gone wrong, and they designed Varsity to avoid every mistake. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 108th Airborne Corps, insisted on several revolutionary changes from previous airborne operations. First, the drop would occur in daylight, but late enough in the morning that ground forces would already be established across the river, forcing Germans to divide their attention. Second, The drop zones would be close, less than 5 miles from the Rhine, within easy reach of advancing ground forces. Third, the airborne forces would land concentrated, not scattered across miles of countryside as had happened in Normandy and Holland. The entire operation would put 2 divisions on the ground in less than 3 hours, creating an instant, cohesive force, rather than scattered groups of paratroopers searching for their units. Fourth, and most crucially, the airborne operation would receive direct air support, unlike anything previously attempted. Fighter bombers would fly top cover continuously. Medium bombers would strike German positions even as paratroopers descended. The coordination required for this approach, preventing friendly fire incidents while delivering maximum firepower, required a level of inter-service cooperation that had never been achieved before. Training for Varsity was intense and realistic. Paratroopers jumped repeatedly under conditions designed to simulate combat, including live fire exercises where artillery fired over their drop zones. Glider pilots practiced landing in confined areas, while ground forces practiced rapid movement towards simulated airborne landing zones. Radio communications were tested and retested until every unit commander could reliably contact both airborne forces and ground units. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the pieces came together along the western bank of the Rhine. Infantry divisions moved into forward positions. Artillery batteries registered their targets. Engineer units positioned their boats and bridging equipment. Airborne divisions loaded their equipment and conducted final briefings. The logistical pipelines supporting this vast force stretched back hundreds of miles, delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily. The Germans, watching from the eastern bank, saw preparations but fundamentally misunderstood their scale. German intelligence was by this point in the war severely degraded. The Luftwaffe, which might have provided aerial reconnaissance, was largely destroyed. German agents in Allied territory had been systematically eliminated or turned. What little intelligence reached German headquarters came from visual observation by troops along the Rhine and from analysis of radio traffic. These sources confirmed that a crossing was being prepared. They indicated that the British Second Army and US Ninth Army were both involved. They identified some specific units, but they dramatically underestimated the total force. German intelligence reports in mid-March estimated that perhaps 3 to 4 Allied divisions were preparing to cross in the northern sector, supported by normal levels of artillery and possibly a limited airborne component. This wasn't incompetence, it was the fog of war, combined with the Allies' successful deception operations that suggested major attacks would come elsewhere. It was also the psychological difficulty of accepting that an enemy would commit such overwhelming force to a single operation. German commanders, experienced in the Wehrmacht's tradition of doing more with less, of achieving victory through superior tactics rather than superior resources, simply couldn't conceive that the Allies would mass 21 divisions for a single river crossing. They were about to learn otherwise. By March 22, 1945, everything was ready. Over 1 million Allied soldiers waited in their assembly areas. Thousands of artillery pieces were loaded and aimed. Hundreds of assault boats lined the riverbank. In Britain, thousands of transport aircraft and gliders prepared for the airborne operation. The largest single military operation in the Western European theater was hours from execution. The formation phase was complete. What had begun as lessons learned from Arnhem's failure had evolved into an operational plan of almost unprecedented scope and sophistication. Montgomery had his redemption operation. Simpson had his chance to demonstrate American efficiency. Ridgway had his opportunity to prove that airborne forces, properly employed, could be decisive. The engineer officers had their meticulously planned river crossing. The artillery commanders had more firepower than they had ever imagined controlling. And across the Rhine, German defenders waited, confident that the great river would give them time to respond, convinced they were facing a manageable threat, believing their intelligence estimates that spoke of 3 divisions. They had no idea what was about to hit them. At its core, the Rhine crossing represented a fundamental shift in how modern warfare could be conducted. The operation embodied several themes that challenged traditional military thinking and established precedents that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The first and most profound theme was the concept of overwhelming force as a form of mercy. This seems paradoxical. How can bringing more destructive power to bear be merciful? But Montgomery and Simpson understood something that many military theorists had struggled with throughout history. Wars fought with insufficient force drag on, creating more casualties on both sides, more destruction, more suffering. The quickest way to end a war is to make continued resistance obviously futile. This philosophy represented a sharp break from the German military tradition that dominated European warfare for generations. German military doctrine, born from necessity in a nation surrounded by potential enemies, emphasized winning through superior tactics, interior lines, and the concentrated employment of mobile forces at decisive points. The Germans had become masters of doing more with less, of achieving operational victories despite material inferiority. The Allies, particularly the Americans, brought a different philosophy to warfare, one rooted in industrial capacity and logistical superiority. Why risk 10,000 lives on a clever tactical maneuver when you can bring such overwhelming force that the enemy's resistance collapses with minimal casualties on both sides? The Rhine crossing took this philosophy to its logical extreme. Consider the artillery preparation. The bombardment that preceded the assault wasn't designed merely to destroy German defensive positions. Conventional artillery could do that. It was designed to create a psychological state in the defenders where coherent resistance became impossible. The German soldiers manning positions along the Rhine experienced something beyond traditional combat, a mechanical, industrial-scale destruction so intense that their world became nothing but noise, blast waves, and earth-churning explosions for hours on end. Survivors of the bombardment, interviewed after the war, described it in terms that transcended normal combat experience. One German soldier recalled, "We knew the Allies had artillery. We'd experienced their bombardments before. But this was different. This was the earth itself trying to shake us into the grave. You couldn't think. You couldn't communicate. You could only press yourself into the soil and pray that the next shell would land somewhere, anywhere else." This represents warfare as industrial process rather than combat as traditionally understood. The goal wasn't merely to win a battle, but to break the enemy's will through the demonstration of such vast material superiority that continued resistance became psychologically impossible. The second major theme was the integration of multiple combat arms into a synchronized system. Modern militaries often speak of combined arms warfare, but the Rhine crossing represented something more sophisticated: the orchestration of infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, airborne forces, tactical aircraft, and logistics into a single, smoothly functioning mechanism. This level of integration required not just operational planning, but a fundamental cultural shift in how different military services and specialties viewed their roles. The artillery wasn't supporting the infantry. Both were part of a unified system. The airborne forces weren't conducting an independent operation. They were one component of a larger machine. The engineers weren't just facilitating movement. They were combat forces whose technical expertise was as crucial as infantry courage or artillery firepower. The operations timetable illustrated this integration. At H hour, the artillery bombardment would reach maximum intensity. At H+2 hours, assault boats would launch. At H+4 hours, the first wave would reach the eastern bank. At H+6 hours, engineers would begin constructing floating bridges. At H+10 hours, the airborne assault would begin. Each phase built on the previous phase, with precise timing that allowed maximum mutual support. This synchronization extended to the tactical level. Artillery observers accompanied assault infantry to call fire on emerging threats. Engineers worked under direct infantry protection. Airborne units carried radios allowing direct communication with ground forces. Fighter bombers could be called to strike specific targets within minutes. The entire system was designed to bring overwhelming force to bear on any point of resistance before that resistance could organize effectively. The third theme was the calculated acceptance of short-term risk for long-term certainty. The Allies could have attempted a surprise crossing with lighter forces, gambling that speed and deception would carry them across before Germans could react effectively. Instead, they chose to mass forces so openly that German intelligence couldn't miss the preparations, then bring such overwhelming power that German knowledge of the attack couldn't help them. This represented a sophisticated understanding of military psychology. Surprise is valuable, but it's a single-use asset. Once the enemy realizes what's happening, surprise is gone. Overwhelming force, by contrast, grows more effective as the enemy becomes more aware of it. The German soldiers manning defenses along the Rhine knew the Allies were coming. This knowledge didn't help them. If anything, it made their situation worse. As they waited for an assault, they knew they couldn't stop. The fourth theme was the relationship between technology and tactical doctrine. The Rhine crossing succeeded not because the Allies possessed radically superior technology. German tanks, artillery, and small arms were often equal or superior to Allied equivalents, but because Allied doctrine effectively leveraged the technology they had. Consider the assault boats. These weren't sophisticated craft. They were simple, mass-produced plywood boats with outboard motors, but the doctrine for their employment was sophisticated. Boats launched in waves with precise timing and spacing, designed to maximize the number of troops reaching the eastern bank while minimizing vulnerability to artillery fire. Each boat carried a specific unit composition designed for immediate tactical effectiveness upon landing. Engineers positioned boats to minimize exposure during loading. Infantry rehearsed embarkation procedures until they could load in darkness in less than 2 minutes. The technology was simple. The doctrine that employed it was elegant. Together they formed a system that delivered infantry across a major water barrier under fire with acceptable casualties. The fifth theme, perhaps most relevant to understanding the intelligence failure that opened this story, was the concept of information overwhelming as a complement to material overwhelming. The Germans didn't lack intelligence about the impending assault. They had reconnaissance units, observation posts, signal intelligence, and informants. They collected enormous amounts of information about Allied preparations, but information isn't intelligence. Intelligence requires processing, analyzing, and correctly interpreting information. The Germans were overwhelmed by the scale of Allied preparations to the point that their intelligence apparatus simply couldn't process what they were seeing. When every sector reports major enemy buildup, when every intelligence source screams urgent threat, the human mind struggles to prioritize. The Germans saw preparations for a 3-division assault not because their reconnaissance was incompetent, but because the idea of a 21-division assault was so far outside normal operational parameters that their cognitive frameworks couldn't accommodate it. The Allies, intentionally or not, had created a situation where the truth was so extreme that it became unbelievable. German commanders who suggested that the Allies might be massing 15 or 20 divisions for the assault were dismissed as alarmist. The estimate of 3 divisions represented not the limit of what Germans could see, but the limit of what they could believe. This theme, the weaponization of scale to create cognitive failure in enemy intelligence systems, would become increasingly relevant as warfare evolved. In an information age, the ability to overwhelm enemy analytical capabilities becomes as important as the ability to overwhelm enemy combat forces. The final major theme was the moral dimension of overwhelming force. Was it ethical for the Allies to bring such massive force against defenders who were already clearly defeated? Germany in March 1945 was a nation in collapse. The war was lost. The Soviets were driving toward Berlin. The industrial capacity to sustain war was destroyed. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel. Why not simply negotiate a surrender rather than conducting a massive assault that would kill thousands more? The answer lies in understanding Nazi Germany's nature. This wasn't a conventional nation-state fighting for rational objectives. The Nazi regime had committed itself to a genocidal ideology that made conventional surrender impossible for its true believers. Every day the war continued. Concentration camps continued operating. Slave laborers continued dying. Germany's remaining resources continued being devoted to pointless military resistance. The Rhine crossing, brutal in its execution, was designed to make continued resistance psychologically impossible, not just for German soldiers, but for German commanders and political leaders. It was a message delivered in artillery shells and paratroopers. The war is over. Resistance is futile. Surrender now or be destroyed completely. This message had to be undeniable, overwhelming, impossible to misinterpret, hence the massive scale of the operation. The Allies weren't just crossing a river. They were demonstrating that they possessed the power to crush any remaining resistance without breaking stride. They were proving that Germany's strategic situation was hopeless, that no river line could be held, that no defense could succeed, that continued resistance would only result in more destruction. In this light, the overwhelming force applied at the Rhine was not merely military necessity, but psychological warfare at strategic scale. The goal was to break not just the German army's ability to resist, but its will to resist. And the rapid collapse of German defenses after the crossing suggests that this strategy succeeded. These themes, overwhelming force as efficiency, sophisticated integration of combat systems, calculated acceptance of exposure over surprise, effective doctrine leveraging simple technology, information overwhelming, and the moral complexity of crushing victory, all came together at the Rhine. Together, they represented not just a successful military operation, but a new way of thinking about warfare itself. And at the center of all these themes was the fundamental intelligence failure that opens our story. German scouts, estimating 3 divisions when 21 were coming. This wasn't simply a mistake. It was the inevitable result of an intelligence system overwhelmed by operational scale beyond its conceptual framework. The Germans weren't just outfought at the Rhine. They were outthought, outplanned, and confronted with a form of warfare their doctrine couldn't accommodate. They were facing the future, and they didn't recognize it until it was far too late. The execution of Operation Plunder and Operation Varsity demonstrated solutions to problems that had plagued military operations throughout the war. These solutions weren't theoretical proposals. They were tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable and proven effective. The first solution addressed the fundamental problem of river crossings under fire. How do you get infantry across a wide, fast-flowing river against a prepared enemy without suffering catastrophic casualties? Military history is littered with failed river crossings. The challenge isn't just the physical difficulty of moving troops across water, but doing so while those troops are completely vulnerable, unable to take cover, unable to maneuver, dependent entirely on boats that can be destroyed by artillery or machine gun fire. The Allied solution was multi-layered. First, suppress enemy fire so completely that defenders cannot effectively engage the crossing force. The artillery bombardment preceding the assault was designed not just to destroy defensive positions, but to force defenders to take cover and keep their heads down during the critical moments when assault boats were most vulnerable. Second, cross at multiple points simultaneously. The assault occurred at dozens of crossing sites along a 50-mile front. German artillery could target individual crossing points, but they couldn't target all of them simultaneously. German reserves could counterattack specific bridgeheads, but they couldn't counterattack everywhere at once. The sheer number of crossing points overwhelmed the German defensive system's ability to respond. Third, accept that first-wave casualties will occur, but minimize time of exposure. The assault boats were fast, capable of crossing the Rhine in 10 to 15 minutes depending on current and crossing point width. Infantry drilled on rapid embarkation and disembarkation. The goal was to minimize the window during which troops were most vulnerable. Fourth, establish bridgeheads quickly and reinforce them before Germans could organize coherent counterattacks. The initial assault waves weren't expected to penetrate deep into German defenses. They were expected to seize a foothold on the eastern bank, clear immediate defensive positions, and hold against counterattack while subsequent waves crossed and bridges were constructed. The results validated this approach. While casualties did occur during the crossing, they were far lighter than historical precedents suggested. The British 13th Corps, crossing near Arnhem, suffered approximately 400 casualties during the initial assault, painful but far below the thousands that might have been expected against prepared defenses. The American 15th Corps, crossing near Rheinberg, reported similar results. The second solution addressed airborne operations. The disasters at Arnhem and the difficulties in Normandy had raised serious questions about whether large-scale airborne operations were viable. The problems were numerous. Paratroopers often scattered over miles of countryside, landing far from objectives. Gliders crashed with high casualty rates. Airborne forces isolated from ground troops faced defeat in detail by enemy armor. Surprise was difficult to achieve in daylight, but accuracy was impossible at night. Operation Varsity solved these problems through several innovations. First, compress the drop time. The entire airborne assault placed 2 divisions on the ground in under 3 hours. This created a concentrated force rather than scattered packets of paratroopers. Second, drop close to friendly forces. The airborne landing zones were within 5 miles of the Rhine, close enough that ground forces could reach them within hours rather than days. Third, drop after ground forces have established a foothold. Unlike Market Garden, where airborne forces dropped ahead of the ground advance and had to survive until relief arrived, Varsity's paratroopers landed after ground forces had already crossed the Rhine. This meant that reinforcement and resupply were certain, not hopeful. German forces in the airborne operations area were immediately trapped between advancing ground forces from the west and airborne forces to their east. Fourth, provide overwhelming air support. Over 2,000 Allied fighters provided top cover for the airborne armada. German fighters attempting to attack the transport aircraft were immediately engaged. German anti-aircraft positions were struck by fighter bombers even as paratroopers descended. The level of air superiority was so complete that most transport aircraft completed their missions without taking serious fire. The results were dramatic. The British 6th Airborne Division landed with 95% of its strength reaching the correct drop zones. The US 17th Airborne Division achieved similar accuracy. Within hours of landing, both divisions had seized their objectives: bridges over the Isle River, German artillery positions, road junctions that would have been critical for German counterattacks. By evening of the first day, ground forces had linked up with airborne units. The casualty rate was significant. Operation Varsity remains the costliest airborne operation in a single day in American history, but the operation achieved its objectives and proved that large-scale airborne assault could work when properly planned and executed. The lessons learned would influence airborne doctrine for decades. The third solution addressed logistics, specifically how to sustain a massive force across a major water barrier. Rivers aren't just obstacles to assault forces, they're obstacles to supply. Armies require enormous quantities of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment daily. A force of 21 divisions attacking across the Rhine would consume thousands of tons of supplies every day. How do you get those supplies across a river when bridges are vulnerable to artillery fire and assault boats can't carry enough cargo? The engineering solution was elegant. Build so many bridges that German artillery cannot destroy them faster than they can be repaired or replaced. Within 48 hours of the initial assault, Allied engineers had constructed multiple floating bridges across the Rhine. These weren't simple pontoon bridges. They were sophisticated structures capable of supporting tank traffic, with redundant sections that could be repaired or replaced under fire. Additionally, amphibious vehicles, DUKW trucks capable of operating on water and land, began ferrying supplies across the Rhine even before bridges were complete. Landing craft used for the initial assault were repurposed for supply delivery. Engineers positioned ferry systems at multiple points. The result was a supply system with such redundancy that even significant German artillery success couldn't interrupt the flow of material to units across the Rhine. By the end of the first week, Allied engineers had constructed rail bridges across the Rhine, allowing freight trains to deliver supplies directly to the eastern bank. The logistical achievement was as impressive as the tactical success. The fourth solution addressed command and control, coordinating 21 divisions, thousands of aircraft, naval elements on the Rhine, and engineer operations across 50 miles of front required communication systems and command structures that simply hadn't existed earlier in the war. The solution combined technology and doctrine. Radio networks were established with multiple redundancies. Each division had direct communication with Corps headquarters. Corps headquarters could contact Army headquarters. Army headquarters maintained contact with airborne commands and air support operations. Critically, commanders at every level had practiced operating these communication systems under simulated combat conditions. Command posts were positioned to allow rapid decision-making while remaining survivable. Montgomery established his tactical headquarters close enough to the Rhine to maintain direct awareness of battle developments, but far enough back to avoid tactical-level disruptions. Corps commanders positioned themselves to observe their sectors directly while maintaining communication with subordinate divisions. The result was a command system that allowed rapid response to emerging situations without creating the confusion that often plagues large-scale operations. When unexpected German resistance appeared at specific points, artillery and air support could be redirected within minutes. When opportunities emerged for rapid advance, reserves could be committed quickly. The command system was both flexible and robust. The fifth solution addressed the problem of enemy intelligence. How do you prepare a massive operation without giving the enemy so much warning that they can prepare devastating countermeasures? The Allies couldn't hide the buildup. Millions of tons of supplies, hundreds of thousands of troops, and thousands of vehicles were positioned along the Rhine over months. German observation posts could see much of this preparation directly. The solution was to make the truth unbelievable. The scale of preparation was so vast that German intelligence couldn't accept what they were seeing at face value. Additionally, Allied deception operations suggested major attacks would come at other points along the Rhine. German commanders received conflicting intelligence, some reports suggesting a northern crossing, others suggesting the main assault would come further south, still others suggesting that Patton's forces might make the main effort. Confronted with overwhelming information and conflicting analyses, German headquarters made the psychologically comfortable choice. They estimated that the assault would be large but manageable, perhaps 3 to 4 divisions, supported by conventional artillery and a limited airborne component. This allowed them to believe they could contain the assault with available forces. The real genius of this approach was that it required no sophisticated deception. The Allies simply prepared such a massive operation that the truth exceeded German commanders' ability to accept it. This represents a profound insight. In warfare, as in other domains, the most effective deceptions often involve telling a truth so extreme that the enemy dismisses it as exaggeration. The sixth solution addressed the psychological dimension of warfare. How do you break an enemy's will to resist? The Rhine crossing answered this question through demonstration of absolute superiority. German defenders weren't just defeated, they were overwhelmed so completely that continued resistance became obviously pointless. The artillery bombardment, the multiple crossing points, the airborne assault, the rapid bridge construction, the massive follow-on forces, all combined to send an unmistakable message. We can bring unlimited force to bear. We can sustain operations indefinitely. You cannot stop us. Surrender now or be destroyed. This psychological warfare proved remarkably effective. German resistance after the Rhine crossing, while continuing, lacked the coherence and determination shown earlier in the war. Units that might have fought stubbornly to hold a position instead withdrew after token resistance. Commanders who might have counterattacked instead conserved their forces. Soldiers who might have fought to the death instead sought opportunities to surrender. The Rhine crossing broke something in the German military psyche. It demonstrated that no defensive line could be held, that no amount of tactical skill could overcome such material superiority, that the war was truly irreversibly lost. This demoralization saved lives on both sides by making continued resistance seem futile. The final solution addressed the moral question of overwhelming force. Critics might argue that bringing such massive force against a clearly defeated enemy was unnecessary, that the Allies should have negotiated rather than executing such a devastating assault. The solution lies in understanding the nature of Nazi Germany and the moral imperative to end the war as quickly as possible. Every day the war continued. Concentration camps operated. Slave laborers died. German cities suffered bombing. German soldiers died in hopeless defensive battles. Allied soldiers died taking ground that would inevitably be taken anyway. The quickest way to end this suffering was to make Germany's defeat so obvious, so complete, so undeniable that even die-hard Nazis would recognize that continued resistance was pointless. The Rhine crossing accomplished this. It demonstrated that the Allies possessed not just the power to defeat Germany, but to crush any remaining resistance without significant effort. This demonstration shortened the war, reduced total casualties on both sides, and hastened the liberation of concentration camps and prisoner-of-war camps. These solutions, sophisticated river-crossing tactics, reformed airborne doctrine, redundant logistics, effective command and control, psychological manipulation of enemy intelligence, demonstration of overwhelming power, and moral clarity about ending the war quickly, represented the Allied answer to the strategic problem of destroying the Third Reich. They worked. Within 3 weeks of the Rhine crossing, German resistance in the West collapsed. Within 6 weeks, Hitler was dead and Germany surrendered unconditionally. The intelligence failure that opens this story, German scouts estimating 3 divisions when 21 were crossing, was thus not merely a tactical mistake. It was the inevitable result of confronting a form of warfare that exceeded the German military's conceptual framework. The Allies didn't just cross the Rhine, they crossed it in a way that redefined what large-scale military operations could achieve. No military operation, regardless of success, is beyond critical examination. The Rhine crossing, for all its achievements, raised questions that military historians and theorists have debated for decades. These questions touch on ethics, efficiency, doctrine, and the fundamental nature of warfare itself. The first criticism concerns proportionality. Was it necessary to bring such overwhelming force against an enemy that was clearly already defeated? By March 1945, Germany's strategic situation was hopeless. The Soviets were advancing on Berlin. German industry was destroyed. The Luftwaffe was grounded. German armies were out of fuel, ammunition, and trained replacements. Why not simply negotiate surrender, rather than executing an assault that, despite its efficiency, still cost thousands of lives? This criticism requires us to consider several factors. First, Nazi Germany was not a conventional nation-state fighting for rational objectives. The regime's ideology precluded rational surrender. Hitler had ordered that Germany should be destroyed rather than surrender. Goebbels was promoting the concept of Endsieg, final victory through sheer will despite material impossibility. The regime would fight until physically unable to continue, regardless of casualties or destruction. Second, negotiated surrender requires a negotiating partner. Who exactly should the Allies have negotiated with? Hitler would never surrender. Other Nazi leaders couldn't surrender without Hitler's authorization or without risking execution for treason. The German military high command had been thoroughly Nazified. Any general attempting to negotiate surrender without authorization would likely have been arrested or killed. Third, delay meant continued operation of concentration camps, continued slave labor, continued suffering for millions of prisoners. The moral imperative to end the war as quickly as possible was not merely military, but humanitarian. Every week the war continued meant thousands more murders in camps, thousands more slave laborers worked to death, thousands more civilians caught in the fighting. Nevertheless, the criticism prompts reflection. Could the Allies have achieved the same result with less force? Possibly. But possibly is a dangerous word in military planning. Operational plans built on possibly get soldiers killed when possibilities fail to materialize. Montgomery and Simpson chose overwhelming force precisely to avoid the possibly scenarios where insufficient force leads to prolonged battle and higher casualties. The second criticism addresses the airborne component specifically. Operation Varsity cost approximately 3,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing on the first day. Critics argue that these casualties were unnecessary because ground forces were already crossing successfully. The airborne assault, while tactically successful, may not have been strategically essential. This criticism has merit. It's possible, perhaps probable, that ground forces could have eventually seized the same objectives taken by airborne units. The bridges over the Yssel, the road junctions, the German artillery positions, all could have been captured by advancing ground forces within days or perhaps weeks. But this argument ignores time's value. Days or weeks of additional fighting mean more casualties, probably more total casualties than the airborne operation cost. Weeks of delay mean weeks of continued concentration camp operations, weeks of additional time for Germany to organize resistance or for political complications to emerge. Moreover, the psychological impact of the airborne assault was significant. German commanders facing both a massive river crossing and a simultaneous airborne assault in their rear found their situation psychologically overwhelming. Some units that might have fought to delay ground forces instead withdrew or surrendered when confronted with encirclement. The airborne operation shortened the battle by breaking German morale. The third criticism concerns the command structure. Montgomery's insistence on controlling the operation, his methodical approach, his refusal to allow improvisation, all of these may have slowed the exploitation phase after the successful crossing. American commanders, particularly Patton, argued that more aggressive, rapid exploitation might have ended the war even faster. This criticism reflects a fundamental philosophical divide between British and American military culture. British commanders, burned by costly failures when aggressive maneuvers outran supply lines, emphasized methodical advances with secure flanks and reliable logistics. American commanders, confident in their logistical capabilities and preferring rapid maneuver, chafed under what they saw as excessive caution. Both philosophies had merit. Montgomery's approach minimized casualties and ensured that gains, once taken, were permanently held. Patton's approach emphasized speed and aggressive exploitation of enemy confusion. The Rhine crossing reflected Montgomery's philosophy because Montgomery commanded the operation. Whether Patton's approach would have been more effective remains unknowable. The fourth criticism addresses intelligence and deception. The German intelligence failure wasn't entirely natural. Allied deception operations deliberately misled German commanders about the attack's location, timing, and scale. Critics argue that such deception, while militarily effective, raises ethical questions about warfare's conduct. This criticism seems, frankly, naive. Deception is an ancient and accepted element of warfare. Every military force attempts to deceive enemies about capabilities, intentions, and operations. The Allies' deception operations were sophisticated, but they were not unprecedented or unethical. They did not involve war crimes, false surrenders, or violations of Geneva Conventions. They simply involved making the enemy believe things that weren't true, which is precisely what military deception has always involved. The fifth criticism concerns the destruction inflicted on German cities during the operation. Wesel, a significant Rhine city, was largely destroyed by Allied bombing and artillery. Critics argue that such destruction of civilian infrastructure was excessive and that more surgical approaches could have achieved military objectives with less collateral damage. This criticism requires understanding the operational reality. Wesel was a major transportation hub, a communications center, and a German defensive strongpoint. Its destruction was militarily necessary to prevent German forces from using it to coordinate defenses or channel reinforcements. Allied commanders faced a choice: attempt to capture Wesel intact, which would cost Allied casualties and might fail, or destroy it from a distance through artillery and air power, which would certainly succeed, but would destroy the city. They chose to preserve Allied lives at the cost of German infrastructure. This choice reflects the fundamental moral calculation of war. Commanders are responsible for their own soldiers' lives and are therefore justified in choosing approaches that minimize friendly casualties, even if such approaches increase collateral damage. Reasonable people can debate whether this calculation was correct, but calling it a war crime or evidence of callous disregard for human life ignores the genuine moral dilemma commanders faced. The sixth criticism addresses the operation's broader strategic context. Some historians argue that the Rhine crossing, while tactically brilliant, was strategically unnecessary. The Soviets were already driving toward Berlin. Germany was collapsing. The Western Allies could have halted at the Rhine, consolidated their positions, and allowed the Soviets to complete Germany's destruction. This would have saved Western Allied lives and avoided the complicated political situation that emerged when American and Soviet forces met in central Germany. This criticism is perhaps the most serious because it questions not the operation's execution, but its necessity. However, it ignores several realities. First, allowing the Soviets to conquer all of Germany would have created an even worse post-war political situation, with the Soviet sphere extending to the Rhine or beyond. The Western presence in central and southern Germany was essential for post-war political arrangements. Second, the concentration camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, and other camps in the western zones were liberated by American and British forces. Allowing the Soviets to complete the war would have meant these camps operated for weeks or months longer, with thousands more deaths. Third, the moral dimension. British and American forces had been fighting Germany since 1939 and 1941 respectively. Halting at the Rhine and allowing the Soviets to complete the victory would have been a moral abandonment of the struggle. The Western Allies had a responsibility to see the war through to complete victory. Finally, the criticism assumes that the war's outcome was certain in March 1945. It wasn't. While Germany's strategic situation was hopeless, Nazi leadership was preparing guerrilla resistance, discussing chemical weapon use, and promoting fanatical resistance. The quickly and certainly the Western Allies pushed into Germany, the less time the Nazi regime had to implement desperate last-ditch measures that might have made the war's final phase even more destructive. Comparing the Rhine crossing with other military operations provides additional perspective. The philosophical approach, overwhelming force applied methodically, contrasts sharply with the German military tradition of achieving victory through superior tactics and operational art, despite material inferiority. German commanders throughout the war executed brilliant maneuvers with limited resources, winning battles they should have lost through clever planning and aggressive execution. The Rhine crossing represented a fundamentally different approach. Overwhelming material superiority applied so systematically that tactical brilliance became irrelevant. This wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was industrial warfare at its purest, with logistics, firepower, and organizational capacity mattering more than tactical ingenuity. This reflects a broader philosophical question. Is warfare primarily a test of tactical skill or primarily a contest of material resources and organizational capacity? The German tradition emphasized the former. The American tradition, particularly as it evolved during World War II, emphasized the latter. The Rhine crossing proved that, at least in modern industrial warfare, material superiority combined with competent planning beats tactical brilliance combined with material inferiority. This lesson would dominate American military doctrine for decades, sometimes to good effect, and sometimes leading to over-reliance on material solutions to problems that required political or diplomatic resolution. The final reflection concerns what the Rhine crossing reveals about warfare's nature in the modern era. Traditional warfare involved battles where tactical skill, operational art, and the moral qualities of soldiers determined outcomes. Two forces of roughly equal capability met, and superior leadership, training, courage, or luck determined the victor. The Rhine crossing represented something different, a military operation where the outcome was essentially predetermined by material superiority so vast that no amount of tactical skill could overcome it. German soldiers at the Rhine could have been 3 times as brave, their commanders 3 times as brilliant, and they still would have lost because the material disparity was simply too great. This raises uncomfortable questions. If warfare becomes primarily a contest of industrial capacity rather than military virtue, what happens to the traditional military values of courage, honor, and tactical excellence? If victory goes reliably to whichever side can mass more artillery shells and aircraft, regardless of the qualities of individual soldiers, does warfare become less a test of national character and more a test of economic output? The Rhine crossing doesn't answer these questions. It couldn't, but it poses them starkly. It demonstrates that in modern warfare, the ability to mobilize and deploy overwhelming material force may matter more than traditional military virtues. This doesn't diminish the courage of the soldiers who crossed the Rhine under fire or the paratroopers who jumped into German airspace, but it does suggest that their courage, while necessary, was not sufficient. Victory required courage plus overwhelming material superiority. This lesson, learned at the Rhine and reinforced throughout the remainder of the 20th century, shaped American military doctrine in ways both positive and negative. Positively, it encouraged investment in military capability, logistics, and the industrial base supporting military operations. Negatively, it sometimes led to overconfidence that material superiority could substitute for political strategy or cultural understanding. The German scouts who estimated 3 divisions when 21 were crossing the Rhine weren't simply making an intelligence mistake, they were witnessing a form of warfare that their military tradition hadn't prepared them to understand. Warfare where material overwhelming mattered more than tactical excellence, where logistics dominated operations, where victory came not to the most skillful, but to the most powerful. This was the future of warfare, and at the Rhine crossing in March 1945, that future arrived with overwhelming, undeniable force. The sky was still dark with aircraft when German resistance along the Rhine effectively collapsed. Not immediately. Pockets of determined defenders fought on for days, but the coherent defensive line that had held since the Allies reached the Rhine in February simply disintegrated. What happened at the Rhine wasn't just a military defeat. It was a revelation that broke the German military's remaining will to resist. By evening on March 24, 1945, less than 24 hours after the assault began, Allied forces had established bridgeheads up to 6 miles deep along a 50-mile front. Engineers were working on their 4th and 5th bridges across the Rhine. Airborne forces had linked up with advancing ground units. German counterattacks had been shattered before they could even organize properly. Within a week, Patton's Third Army had crossed further south. Within 2 weeks, the Ruhr industrial region was encircled. Within 3 weeks, German resistance in the west had effectively ended as a coherent military operation. Individual units fought on, some fanatically, but the German military structure in the Western theater had broken. The intelligence failure that opens this story, 3 divisions estimated when 21 were attacking, ultimately symbolizes more than a simple mistake. It represents the moment when one form of warfare decisively defeated another, when industrial might overwhelmed tactical skill, when the future defeated the past. The German military tradition that dominated European warfare for generations emphasized victory through superior tactics and operational art. The German army had won battles throughout history, despite being outnumbered or outgunned, because German commanders were brilliant, German soldiers were tough, and German tactical doctrine was sophisticated. This tradition made the Wehrmacht the most formidable fighting force of the early war years. But that tradition met its end at the Rhine. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome 21 divisions supported by over 5,000 artillery pieces and absolute air superiority. No amount of soldier toughness could withstand artillery bombardment so intense that it literally reshaped the landscape. No amount of sophisticated doctrine could counter an enemy that simply brought overwhelming force to every point of contact. The scouts who reported 3 divisions were seeing with eyes trained in the old tradition, where military operations were constrained by logistics, where commanders had to carefully husband limited resources, where battles were fought with roughly comparable forces. They literally couldn't conceive of an enemy that would mass 21 divisions for a single operation, because such concentration of force was outside their conceptual framework. But the Allies, particularly the Americans, brought a different approach to warfare, an approach rooted in industrial capacity and logistical excellence. An approach that said, why fight a fair battle when you can bring such overwhelming force that the outcome is never in doubt? Why risk your soldiers in a fair fight when you can deliver such crushing superiority that enemy resistance collapses before serious fighting even begins? This approach wasn't about cowardice or lack of military virtue. It was about efficiency. It was about ending the war as quickly as possible with minimum casualties on both sides. It was about making continued resistance so obviously futile that rational commanders would surrender rather than sacrificing their men in hopeless battles. And it worked. The Rhine crossing broke the back of German resistance in the west. It demonstrated that no defensive position could be held, that no tactical skill could overcome material superiority of such magnitude. It sent an unmistakable message to every German commander, every German soldier, every German civilian. The war is over. Resistance is futile. Surrender now, or be destroyed. The German scouts who filed their report estimating 3 divisions didn't live in ignorance long. By the afternoon of March 24th, as the sky filled with paratroopers and the Rhine bridges multiplied and the artillery fire continued without pause, they understood their mistake. But understanding came too late to matter. The bridges were already built. The bridgeheads were already established. The airborne forces were already on the ground. The overwhelming force was already deployed. They had estimated 3 divisions. They got 21. That 7-fold miscalculation wasn't stupidity. It was the old world failing to understand the new world, the old way of warfare confronting a new way that rendered the old traditions obsolete. The lessons of the Rhine crossing echoed through military doctrine for decades. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, all reflected in different ways the fundamental insight that overwhelming material superiority, properly applied, determines outcomes in modern warfare. Sometimes this lesson was applied wisely. Sometimes it led to overconfidence and strategic failure, when material superiority proved insufficient to achieve political objectives. But on that March morning in 1945, when German scouts looked across the Rhine and saw what they thought was a manageable threat, the lesson was pure and clear. In modern industrial warfare, material overwhelming isn't just an advantage. It's a form of warfare that transcends traditional combat, that breaks enemy will before the battle is truly joined, that makes victory not just likely, but inevitable. The Rhine crossing wasn't the largest battle of World War II. It wasn't the bloodiest. It wasn't the longest, but it was in many ways the most perfectly executed large-scale military operation of the European war. It took every lesson learned from 4 years of brutal combat and applied those lessons with methodical, crushing efficiency. It demonstrated what modern military forces could achieve when planning, resources, and determination all aligned toward a single objective. Those German scouts filing their report about 3 divisions deserve neither mockery nor condemnation. They saw what their training and experience prepared them to see. They reported what seemed rational given their understanding of warfare. They made the estimate that any competent intelligence officer would have made given the conceptual framework of traditional military operations. They were just looking at something unprecedented, something their framework couldn't accommodate, something so extreme that the truth seemed like exaggeration. They were watching the future arrive, and they didn't recognize it until it was far too late. By the time they understood that 21 divisions were crossing the Rhine, those divisions were already across, and the war in the West was effectively over. The only question remaining was how long Germany would take to formally acknowledge what had become obvious to anyone paying attention. The Third Reich was finished, the war was lost, and continued resistance would only add to the catastrophic toll already exacted. The Rhine crossing answered that question decisively. Within 6 weeks, Hitler was dead, and Germany surrendered unconditionally. The greatest war in human history ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with a whimper of exhaustion, as the last defenders finally admitted what the Rhine crossing had made undeniable. 3 divisions estimated, 21 divisions deployed. The difference between those numbers measures more than an intelligence failure. It measures the gap between old warfare and new, between tactical excellence and material overwhelming, between what seemed possible and what actually was possible when a nation committed its full industrial might to a single military objective. That gap, revealed so starkly at the Rhine in March 1945, defined warfare for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The scouts who made that estimate witnessed the future, even if they didn't understand what they were seeing until it was too late to matter. The Rhine River, which had protected Germany for 2,000 years, was crossed in a single day. The defense that was supposed to be impregnable collapsed in less than a week. The war that might have dragged on for months ended in weeks. And the military tradition that emphasized tactical skill over material power learned its final devastating lesson. In modern warfare, overwhelming force doesn't just win battles, it makes battles irrelevant. The German scouts estimated 3 divisions. They were off by a factor of 7. That miscalculation changed nothing about the outcome. The Allies would have crossed the Rhine regardless of German estimates, but it revealed everything about how warfare had changed, how the old certainties had become obsolete, and how the future of conflict would be shaped by those who could mobilize and deploy crushing material superiority. On that March morning, when the artillery opened fire and the sky filled with aircraft and the assault boats launched from 100 points along the river, the German defenders finally understood what was coming for them. It was too late to stop it. It was too late to respond effectively. It was too late to do anything but endure the overwhelming force that was about to sweep them aside. They had estimated 3 divisions. They faced 21. And in that terrible miscalculation lies the story of how wars end. Not with dramatic final stands, but with the crushing realization that resistance has become futile, that the enemy's power is too vast to oppose, that continued fighting will only add to the casualties without changing the inevitable outcome. The Rhine was crossed. Germany was defeated. The war was won. And the lesson was learned, even if that lesson sometimes led military planners astray in later conflicts. In modern warfare, overwhelming force properly applied is not merely an advantage. It is victory itself, delivered with industrial efficiency and terrible certainty. The scouts who estimated 3 divisions witnessed that truth, even if they didn't understand it, until the moment was already past, and the river was already crossed, and the future had already arrived in the form of 21 divisions, thousands of artillery pieces, absolute air superiority, and the methodical, unstoppable advance of a military machine that had learned every lesson, corrected every mistake, and assembled every resource necessary to deliver crushing, overwhelming, undeniable victory. That was the Rhine crossing. That was the end of the Third Reich. That was the moment when one era of warfare ended and another began, revealed in the terrible arithmetic of 3 divisions estimated and 21 divisions deployed.